Chapter 1. The Portrait in Moonlight. The solicitor's letter arrived on the eve of autumn equinox, sealed in wax the color of old blood. Isolde had been sketching in the orphanage garden when Sister Margaret pressed the cream envelope into her calloused fingers. 17 years of institutional life had taught her to read bad news before opening it, the way the nun's lips tightened, how her weathered hands trembled slightly. Still, nothing prepared her for the words. You are the sole heir to Thornwick Manor, accumulated inheritance of House Ashford, pending your immediate residence. The orphanage had never felt like home. Neither had the factory where they'd apprenticed her at 14, nor the dressmaker's cramped attic where she'd slept among bolts of silk and the ghosts of her unremembered parents. But Thornwick, the name alone conjured something in her chest, a pull like moonlight on the tide. She arrived on a night when rain hammered the carriage windows like desperate fingers. The manor materialized through the downpour like something drowned and resurfacing. 3 stories of blackened stone, its Victorian Gothic architecture all turrets and pointed arches, encircled by a wrought iron fence that seemed designed to keep something in rather than intruders out. The grounds sprawled wild. Gardens had surrendered to shadow and creeping ivy, and the fountain in the courtyard stood empty, its angel statue watching with blind stone eyes. Haunted, that place, the coachman muttered, refusing to carry her trunk beyond the gate. Hasn't had a proper resident in 40 years. They say things move at midnight, things without owners. Isolde had learned long ago that lonely people always sensed spirits in empty spaces. She pressed a coin into his palm, money she didn't have, and walked into Thornwick alone. Her small leather suitcase banging against her leg, her breath misting in the preternatural cold. The interior was a cathedral of dust and shadow. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating sheets draped over furniture like corpses. The air tasted of iron and lavender, old and incongruous. Her footsteps echoed against marble floors as she climbed the grand staircase, trailing her fingers along a banister of ebony wood carved with roses and thorns entwined so intricately they blurred together. The solicitor had left instructions. Her room would be the east chamber, 3rd floor. She found it easily enough, a 4-poster bed with burgundy velvet, a writing desk of inlaid mahogany, windows that overlooked the moor stretching endlessly toward a distant line of pine forest. But what stopped her breath was the portrait. It hung in a gilt frame above the fireplace, a man painted in shadows and candlelight. Not a young man, perhaps 40, though his eyes held the weight of centuries. His face was beautiful in a way that made pain bloom in her throat. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw refined by suffering, skin so pale it seemed luminescent against the dark doublet he wore. His dark hair fell past his shoulders, but it was his eyes, rendered in oils so skillfully they seemed to follow her, that pinned her to the floorboards. They were an impossible color, silver gray, ancient, burning, with something between despair and hunger. She knew those eyes. Not from memory, she had no memories before the orphanage, but from somewhere deeper. The place where dreams lived, the place where blood memory whispered before waking, stole the words. I know you, they seemed to say. I've been waiting for you to know yourself. Isolde turned away from the portrait, her heart hammering against her ribs. The manor had already begun to unsettle her, all empty halls and creeping damp. And now this, a painting that felt less like art and more like surveillance, like being recognized by a ghost. She unpacked mechanically, 3 dresses, undergarments, the leather journal filled with her sketches. Drawing was the only language she'd ever truly spoken. As a child, what few memories she retained, she'd filled margins with faces, with hands, with scenes of violence and grace she had no words for. The orphanage tried to whip the habit out of her. Sister Margaret had called it vanity. The factory supervisor called it laziness. But in the attic at the dressmaker's, late into the night, she'd drawn everything. The cruel angles of the master's face, the way moonlight fractured through rain-spotted glass, the figure that haunted her dreams, tall, noble, wounded, looking back at her across some impassable distance. The same man from the portrait. She'd sketched him 100 times and never known his name. That night, she lay in the four-poster bed listening to the old house settle. Wind moved through the walls like breath. Pipes groaned, and then, at precisely midnight, she watched the mantel clock's hands align. Something changed in the quality of darkness. The portrait began to glow, not with light, but with presence. The shadows in the painting seemed to deepen, to acquire dimension. The silver eyes brightened, and then, so subtly she almost missed it, the man's head turned. His profile now, gazing toward the window, where moonlight pooled silver on the floorboards. His lips moved, not words, but breath, a sigh that seemed to travel across 20 years of longing. "I am still here," that sigh seemed to say. "I have always been here. Waiting in the dark, waiting for you to return." Isolde sat upright, her heart a bird in a cage of ribs. She lit the lamp with shaking hands, the light dispelling the portrait's strangeness, returning it to mere paint and canvas. But when she looked back, a detail caught her eye. A small brass nameplate beneath the gilt frame, tarnished with age. She moved closer, squinting to read the inscription. Lucien Ashford, Lord of Thornwick. Painted 1847. Lucien. The name fell through her like a stone through dark water, finding depths she didn't know she possessed. The name her dreams had, whispered. The name she'd written 100 times in her journal, always wondering if she was mad. Below the nameplate, someone had carved fresh words into the frame itself, the wood still pale where a knife had split it. For the one who paints me in her heart before meeting me in flesh, the mirror shows what the soul knows. Wait for the blood moon, wait for midnight, I will come. The handwriting was archaic, the flourishes elaborate. It might have been dated centuries past. It might have been carved yesterday. In the lamplight, Isolde couldn't tell. She returned to bed but didn't sleep. Instead, she pulled her journal to her lap and began to sketch from memory. Not the portrait's formal beauty, but the thing beneath it. The loneliness, the hunger, the immortal ache of someone who had loved across impossible distances, who had waited in shadow for a soul to recognize itself. As her pencil moved, she felt it, a presence at the edge of her consciousness. Not intrusive, but intimate. Like someone watching her draw, seeing not just the lines, but the blood and bone beneath them. Like someone finally being seen after centuries of being invisible. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and roses and something older. The metallic tang of blood on snow, of centuries crystallized into a single moment. In the portrait above her fireplace, the silver eyes gleamed in the darkness. And midnight had only just begun. Chapter 2. Blood Memory. Dreams and waking had become indistinguishable. For 3 nights, Isolde existed in the space between them, that liminal realm where the portrait's eyes followed her, where she heard footsteps in empty corridors, where the scent of night-blooming jasmine would suddenly perfume the air despite the gardens being long dead. Her sketches had taken on a feverish quality. She'd filled 30 pages with variations of his face, Lucien in sorrow, in rage, in tenderness, in hunger. Always the same eyes, that ancient silver burning with recognition and desperate longing. The manor had begun to feel less like a place and more like a living thing. It breathed around her. Candles lit themselves in the halls before she passed through them. The library doors, which had been sealed with rot and rust, had opened of their own accord. She'd found them that way on the second morning, revealing shelves of leather-bound books in languages she didn't recognize, medical texts annotated in margins with precise, anguished handwriting that could only be his. She read compulsively. Renaissance alchemical theory, medieval theology, medical manuscripts on the nature of blood as a conduit for memory, for identity, for the transmission of consciousness between bodies. In the margins, someone had written, "The blood remembers what the mind forgets. The blood is the record of the soul. To drink is to inherit. To give is to be reborn." The handwriting was his. On the 4th night, she found his journal. It sat on the library desk as if, Placed deliberately, a volume bound in unmarked leather, its pages yellowed with age beyond measure. The dates began in 1347. The handwriting had evolved over centuries, from medieval script to Renaissance flourish to Victorian precision. He documented everything: his transformation into a creature of darkness, his attempt at redemption through monastic life, the curse that followed him even into holy ground, the slow accumulation of centuries until time itself became a kind of death. But the later entries, those from the past year, were different. They were variations of a single obsession. I saw her in the mirror again. Not my reflection, her. A girl with eyes like starlight and hands that know how to draw sorrow. She sketches my face and I feel it. Each line a cut, each shadow a caress. She is painting me into existence. Or I am painting her into mine. The boundaries dissolve in the dark. Another entry, dated weeks earlier. The blood calls to her. I feel it in my bones. She carries Ashford blood, though she doesn't know it. A bloodline I thought I'd destroyed. A bloodline I scattered across centuries to protect from what I am. And now she returns, drawn by the manor itself, drawn by me, drawn by the memory in her very cells of what she is meant to become. And the most recent, dated 3 days ago. She is here, at Thornwick. I can taste her in the air, the particular sweetness of her blood, the music of her pulse. She sleeps above me, and I watch from the walls themselves. I want to drain her. I want to protect her. I want to bind her to me for eternity. I want to set her free. I am unraveling. The hunger grows. If I do not see her soon, if I do not speak with her, while some shred of my humanity remains, I will become the monster they all fear. And she will be the first to bleed. Isolde's hands trembled as she set the journal down. That night, she slept and found herself in the mirror chamber. She didn't remember descending from her room, but here she stood, barefoot on cold marble, surrounded by mirrors that reflected not her image but his. Lucien in 1,000 variations, all watching her with those silver eyes. The mirrors showed him not as the portrait rendered him, but as he was, beautiful and terrible, his pale skin seeming to glow with some inner radiance, his shadow moving independent of light, his mouth open as if mid-breath, mid-word, mid-transformation. "Do not be afraid," he said, though she saw him in no reflection. His voice came from everywhere, from the marble beneath her feet, from the air itself, from some chamber in her own chest. "You have been summoning me since the moment you learned to dream." She turned, but there was no one behind her, only mirrors, only her own face, caught between terror and something else, something that looked like recognition, like homecoming. "I don't know you," she whispered. "You know me better than I know myself." The voice was achingly beautiful, cultured in a way that suggested centuries of refined conversation. "You paint me. Night after night, you reach across the void and sketch my face into being. Do you know what it means, when a mortal woman draws a vampire's true form? She remembers his soul. She sees past the curse." "Why?" Her voice broke. "Why me?" The mirrors rippled as if responding to the question. When they stilled, she saw something else in them, not the portrait, but a vision. A girl, herself somehow, with dark hair and intelligent eyes, dressed in the clothes of another era. She stood in this very chamber, and before her knelt a man who hadn't yet become what he was. A man still human, still beautiful, still capable of being saved. "You were here before," Lucien said. "You walked these halls with my name on your lips. You loved me when I was yet human, and I was too cowardly to accept it. I left you. I ran to the continent, to darkness, to damnation, thinking I could escape what we were meant to be. And I cursed the bloodline, scattered it across centuries. But souls are not so easily parted. They find each other. They recognize each other. Your blood, Isolde, it called across the years and centuries to mine. Your sketches are love spells. Your dreams are invocations. You've been resurrecting me, one line at a time. That's impossible. But even as she said it, she felt the truth resonating through her bones. The orphanage, the factory, the dressmaker's attic. They'd all been stations on a journey she didn't choose, a path laid out by blood and fate. She'd always been meant to arrive at Thornwick. She'd always been meant to find the portrait. She'd always been meant to remember. "Come to me," Lucian whispered, and she understood that he was offering something far more complex than love. He was offering recognition, restoration, the completion of a cycle that had spanned lifetimes. "Let me show you what we were, what we could be again." The mirrors began to move, spinning her slowly, dizzily toward the chamber's center. And in that pivotal moment, suspended between waking and sleeping, between the woman she was and the woman she'd been, Isolde felt the first sweet, terrible pull of desire. Not for him as he was, but for the completeness he promised, for the end of being exiled from her own soul. She opened her mouth to answer, and a voice that could have been her own whispered, "Yes, yes, find him. It is time to stop painting ghosts and become the ghost myself." Chapter 3. The Aristocrat of Shadow. She found him in the library, not as an apparition, but as flesh. It was evening when she descended, drawn by the candlelight that spilled from beneath the heavy oak doors. She dressed carefully, a burgundy gown from Thornwick's wardrobe, something that belonged to the manor's better days, something that felt like armor and surrender both. Her hands had been steady while pinning her hair, but now, crossing the threshold into the library, they betrayed her by trembling. He stood before the fireplace, silhouetted against flames that burned without wood or coal. He wore a doublet of midnight silk, and when he turned toward her, it was with the careful, measured movement of someone learning to exist in a body again. "Isolde," he said, and her name was a prayer in his mouth, a word he'd been practicing for centuries. "You came." "I've been coming," she answered, surprising herself with her courage, "since before I knew what I was coming toward." Up close, the portrait had lied. Or rather, it had told only half the truth. His beauty was real. Cheekbones that seemed carved by suffering itself. Skin luminescent as marble. That impossible silver in his eyes. But the painting had missed the rest. The terrible warmth radiating from him despite his coldness. The faint scent of night-blooming flowers. And something metallic beneath. The way the air around him seemed to fracture like light through a prism. He was not quite human. He was not quite real. "You're afraid," he said softly. It wasn't a question. "Should I be?" "Yes." No hesitation. No false comfort. "I am 473 years old. I have been everything from holy man to monster. I have drunk from the veins of mortals and baptized my victims in their own blood. I have loved 6 lifetimes of women and destroyed them all. And you are 17, mortal, fragile as starlight. You should be terrified of me." But his eyes said something different. They said, "I am terrified of myself. Only you might save me from that terror." "How did I know to draw you?" Isolde moved deeper into the library, drawn to the fireplace despite every warning her body screamed. "How did I know your face before ever seeing it?" "Blood remembers," he said, and the words echoed his journal's philosophy. "When I scattered the Ashford line across centuries, trying to save them from what I'd become, I thought I was severing the connection. But blood is not so easily divided. It pulses across time. It dreams of its source. You are descended from my sister, my only family, born human, who loved me even after I became this. She carried my blood through the generations, diluted but persistent. And you somehow inherited not just her blood, but her love. You remembered me before memory became possible." He reached toward her, then stopped, hands suspended in the space between them. Such care in that gesture, such desperate restraint. "If I touch you," he continued, "if I let myself feel your warmth, I may not be able to stop. The hunger is a living thing. It speaks louder than my conscience. It whispers that your blood would be redemption, that to drain you would be an act of grace, returning you to the eternal realm, freeing you from mortality's pain. You need to understand that." You need to know what you would be risking." Isolde looked at his suspended hand. Even at a distance, she could feel the pull of it, not unpleasant, but magnetic. A calling that resonated in her cells, in the blood, he spoke of so knowingly. "I've been coming to Thornwick my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it. Every sketch was a step closer. Every dream was a beacon. Every moment before this has been waiting. And now I'm here, and you're real, and you're asking me to be afraid. But I'm not afraid, Lucienne. I'm only afraid of waking up and finding this was a dream." His hand closed around hers. The contact was ice and fire both. His skin was deathly cold, but where they touched, heat bloomed, not unpleasant, but disorienting. She gasped, and he pulled back immediately, but not before she felt something else. A vibration in his touch, like a second heartbeat, like centuries learning to recognize themselves in a single moment. "Tell me something true," she whispered. "Not philosophy, not vampire lore, something true." He turned back to the fire, and in the flickering light, she saw something in him soften. "When I was human," he said, "I had a sister. She was braver than me. She wanted to change the world, to question authority, to love without permission. I was weak. I ran from my destiny, and she loved me anyway. Loved me enough to follow me even after I became this curse. I thought I'd destroyed that bloodline to save it from me. But she survived, and her love survived with her, encoded in blood, passed down through generations. And now you are here, her descendant, her echo, looking at me with the same eyes of forgiveness she had. And I—" His voice fractured. "I don't know how to accept grace that I don't deserve." Isolde moved toward him again. This time, he didn't pull away. "Maybe I came back," she said, "not to save you, but to tell you that you were forgiven a long time ago. That the love between us, across lifetimes, across the curse itself, maybe that's the only real thing. Maybe that's redemption." He cupped her face in his cold hands, and she felt it then, the full force of his hunger, his loneliness, his desperate need to be seen as something other than a monster. His eyes burned silver, and for a moment, she thought he might bind her to him through blood. Instead, he lowered his forehead to hers and wept, blood-red tears that fell like rain onto her collarbone. "I have been waiting for this moment," he whispered, "since the day I learned I would never die." And Isolde understood, in that instant, that she had already chosen. Not just to love him, but to become whatever loving him would transform her into. She had chosen the moment she took up her pencil and began to sketch his face. She had chosen the moment she read his journal and recognized her own heart in his words. She had chosen the moment Thornwick's gates opened and she walked inside. The only question now was, how much of her humanity was she willing to surrender? Chapter 4. The First Wound. The wound came 3 nights later, accidental but inevitable, like all transformative wounds. They'd spent the hours between dusk and midnight in the library, talking. Lucienne showed her his journals, centuries of them, bound and boxed, the accumulated consciousness of a man trying to justify his damnation through philosophy and study. He read to her from Renaissance poetry in Italian, medieval prayer books in Latin, modern English novels he'd written pseudonymously and hidden among his collections. His mind was a cathedral of learning, built to hold back the darkness of hunger and solitude. But it was her drawings he returned to obsessively. She'd brought her journal, and as he turned the pages, seeing himself rendered 100 times, 1,000 times, each sketch a love letter written in graphite and shadow, something changed in his expression. It wasn't joy, exactly. It was recognition of joy as a concept he'd forgotten, then remembering it all at once, overwhelming enough to crack something inside him. "You see me this way?" he'd asked, tracing a particular drawing where she'd captured him mid-transformation, the silver eyes intense with hunger, the mouth open to speak or bite, the whole figure suspended between human and predator. "Even knowing what I am, you see this as beautiful?" "Especially knowing what you are," she'd replied. Now they stood in the crypt beneath the manor, a space he'd kept hidden from her until tonight, when he seemed ready for her to understand the full scope of what he was. The crypt was vast, vaulted, lit by candles that burned with that same eerie intensity as the library fireplace. Stone sarcophagi lined the walls, each one bearing a name carved in the language of centuries past, his family. The bloodline he carried within him like a tomb. At the chamber's center lay another coffin, open, lined with soil from his birthplace in Eastern Europe. A sensory memory made manifest, the only sleep he required, the only rest his immortal body could accept. He'd shown it to her without shame. "This is where I die every dawn," he'd said. "The curse demands it. The sun's light is agony beyond description. So I retreat here, into darkness, into earth, and I sleep the sleep of the damned until evening returns me to consciousness and hunger." She'd stepped to the coffin's edge and, moved by something she couldn't name, had leaned down and placed her forehead against the soil as if blessing it, as if acknowledging what it meant that he chose this, night after night, for centuries, that he chose resurrection and isolation and hunger again and again. That's when he'd bitten her. It wasn't an attack, nothing so deliberate or conscious. She lifted her head from the coffin, and her hair had fallen back, exposing the curve of her neck. And Lucian, watching her gesture of reverence, watching her own blood rise to the surface of her skin in response to her own grief for him, had simply given in. His fangs descended. He moved with supernatural speed. His teeth pierced the junction of her neck and shoulder, and, Isolde thought she would scream. Instead, she gasped. The pain was immediate but secondary, a mere border to the sensation that bloomed as he drew blood. It was intimate in a way that transcended physicality. Each pull of blood felt like a word being drawn from her. Her memories, her emotions, her identity, all of it flowing into him like a river finding its source. She felt his hunger, his longing, his desperate relief at finally tasting what his soul had been reaching toward for centuries. She felt his love. It was overwhelming, incapacitating. Her knees buckled and he caught her, cradling her against his cold body as he drank. The crypt spun around her. Candlelight fractured into stars. And then she began to see. Visions flooded her consciousness. Lucian as he'd been, young and beautiful and human, walking through markets of Renaissance Florence. Lucian kneeling in a cathedral, trying to pray away the bloodlust that began as fever and became destiny. Lucian the first time he tasted human blood and understood that damnation tasted of wine and ecstasy and infinite loneliness. Then the vision shifted. She saw herself, or the woman she'd been, the one whose blood carried forward through generations. She stood in Thornwick's halls, looking at Lucian with eyes full of understanding and forgiveness. "I forgive you," the vision Isolde whispered, "for leaving, for becoming this, for thinking I could love less than eternity." And Lucian, human then, not yet cursed, had pulled her close and held her while she wept, knowing even then that he would become a monster, and she would love him anyway. "Come back to me," the vision Isolde had whispered. "No matter how long it takes, no matter what you become. Find me in the blood. Find me in the dreams. Come back." The vision fractured, and Isolde gasped as Lucian withdrew, his eyes wild, his mouth painted in her blood. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, or for the first time across centuries. "You saw," he said, not a question. "I saw." Her voice was strange, dreamlike. Where his teeth had pierced her skin, she felt no pain, only a strange heat spreading through her body, like fever learning to sing. "I saw us. Before. When she loved you." "The blood carries memory," he said, and she could hear the awe in his voice. "But only the worthy can access it. Only—" He stopped, pulling back to study her more carefully. In the candlelight, his eyes had shifted colors. Still silver, but now shot through with gold and deep violet, colors that shouldn't exist in mortal perception. "Only what?" she asked. "Only the chosen," he whispered. "Only the one meant to be bound to me. The visions don't come from my blood. They come from yours. Your blood is remembering. Your blood is telling me what mine should have known all along, that you are not descended from my bloodline, Isolde. You are my bloodline. You are the reincarnation of the only woman I ever loved, cycling back through death and mortality to find me again." She touched the wound on her neck. Her fingers came back stained red. "Is this the beginning?" she asked softly, "of becoming what you are?" He took her hand, pressed it to his chest where no heartbeat lived. "This is the first stitch," he said. "If you want more, if you want to complete the binding, you have only to ask. But understand, once you taste me, you will be changed forever. You will become my reflection, my mirror, my equal in darkness and hunger. You will never die. You will never age beyond this moment. You will feel everything I feel, see everything I see. You will be bound to me so completely that it will be impossible to say where I end and you begin." Isolde closed her eyes. In her mind, she could still see the visions, the centuries of waiting, of watching the world change while he remained static and hungry and alone. She could feel, echoing through her own cells, the weight of 400 years. And underneath it all, like a river of blood running through bedrock, she felt the truth. She had been searching for him her entire life, not because she was cursed, but because she had already chosen eternity with him long before eternity became a possibility. "Then let me taste you," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Let me complete the circle. I have been painting your face long enough. It's time to become the brush myself." Chapter 5. The unraveling past. The transformation began in blood and shadow, gentle at first, then consuming. Lucien guided her to his study, a room she hadn't seen before, deliberately hidden behind a portrait in the library that slid away to reveal a passage. Within was a world unto itself, alchemical apparatus, medieval grimoires, astronomical charts, and in the center, a silver chalice filled with wine the color of old garnets. "My blood," he explained, handing her the cup with ceremonial care. "I feed every fortnight to sustain immortality, but for this, for binding, we use ritual, ceremony, words. I want your transformation to mean something beyond hunger, and hunger become need." She lifted the chalice to her lips. His blood was not like human wine. It moved in her mouth with volition, like something alive. It tasted of centuries, copper and roses, midnight and cathedral incense, the layered complexity of a man who had lived 1,000 lives. And as she swallowed, the visions returned, but deeper now, more intimate. She saw Lucien's first death. It was 1347, a plague year in Venice. He'd been a priest, devoted and pure-hearted, administering last rites to the dying. A dying woman, mad with fever, had sunk her teeth into his wrist. He should have been terrified. Instead, he'd felt her dying agony drain into him, felt her memories and suffering become his own, and in that symbiosis, he'd understood something that his priesthood had never taught him, that to carry another's pain is to be transformed by it, that to drink is to be reborn. The infection took 3 nights to consume him, 3 nights of fever dreams, where the boundaries of self dissolved. When he rose on the 4th night, he was no longer human. He was aperture, a wound in the world where hunger spoke in absolute terms. He'd tried to die, naturally. The consecrated ground had burned him. Holy water had seared his skin. And so he'd chosen the path of isolation, moving to monasteries at the world's edges, taking vows of silence, trying to pray his way through centuries of damnation. But prayer didn't work. Penance didn't work. What worked was accepting that he was not cursed by evil, but transformed by it into something that transcended morality's borders. Then came the vision of her. It must have been 1520s Florence, his 2nd century of darkness, when he first saw her in the mirror. A young woman with intelligent eyes and an artist's hands, waiting for him across an impossible distance. At first he thought her a phantom born from hunger and madness. But she appeared again and again in reflections, in dreams, always waiting, always watching him with infinite patience and forgiveness. So he sought her out. It took him 50 years to trace bloodlines back through the Ashford family tree, following the threads of genealogy until he found a descendant named Evangelina, a lady's maid in Rome with dark eyes and the bearing of someone born to nobility. She was married, already aging, but the moment he saw her, he knew. She had the bloodline. She carried the memory in her cells. He introduced himself under an assumed name. He courted her as a widow, for he'd claimed that fiction. And over the course of months, he shared with her the truth of what he was. And instead of fleeing or calling priests, Evangelina had simply taken his hand and said the words he'd been waiting centuries to hear. I know you. I have always known you. I will know you in every life to come. That first love had lasted 5 years. When she died of natural causes, he'd wept blood for the first time, crimson tears that had burned patterns into the stone where they fell. But she had given him something precious in death, proof that the visions were real, that across the mechanisms of reincarnation and bloodline, the same soul could find him again, could recognize him, could choose him. And so he'd made a pact with whatever forces govern the dark, scatter the bloodline, hide it in poverty, in servitude, in orphanages and factories and forgotten places. Let the souls be reborn in isolation, stripped of status and memory, so that when they found him, it would be pure. Not through recognition of power or position, but through the magnetism of soul to soul. 6 times he'd found her. 6 women across 300 years, each one carrying the same light in her eyes, the same capacity for infinite forgiveness, and each one had chosen to bind herself to him completely, to become what he was. The last had been in 1893, a woman named Magnolia who'd loved him for 15 years before dying in childbirth, carrying not just his love but his child, a daughter who'd been given up to a foundling hospital and lived just long enough to pass the bloodline forward once more. That foundling, Lucienne said softly, pulling Isolde back from the visions, was your great-great-grandmother. The one who carried the compulsion that brought you to draw my face. That brought you here. Isolde felt the weight of it, not burdensome, but clarifying. She wasn't a random orphan with mysterious origins. She was a deliberate creation, a soul that had been cycling through time, following a path laid out by love and blood and the immortal's desperate need to be forgiven. How many of them are still alive? She asked. How many women have you bound to you? 3, he said, and she heard the pain in his voice. The others I had to let go. The curse is not without mercy. After 300 years, we can choose to release each other, to sever the bond and let the immortal partner die. Magnolia chose death, and I let her, because I could not bear to watch her suffer through eternity. The others found peace in that release, but these 3... He paused. These 3 I have not been able to release, and they have not asked it of me. We are bound, Isolde, and you would be joining a covenant of souls that transcends time and geography. She should have felt something like betrayal. Instead, she felt completion. Of course there were others. Of course this love was vast enough to hold multiple eternities. She'd always known, on some level, that she was part of something larger than 2 hearts. She'd been painting not just Lucienne, but the entire architecture of his longing across centuries. Will they know me? She asked. Yes. He cupped her face in his hands, and she realized her own eyes had begun to change, the pupils dilating to inhuman proportions, the iris finding traces of silver that hadn't been there before. You will feel them. Across any distance, you will sense them. Evangeline in Prague, still perfecting her craft as a musician. Serafina in New Orleans, gathering a coven of witches and walking the boundary between light and dark. And Cordelia... He paused, something like grief flickering across his beautiful face. Cordelia in Edinburgh, alone, having chosen isolation over the pain of loving me. Why? Isolde whispered. Because immortality has a cost to sorrow. It asks us to watch everyone we love die. It demands that we become comfortable with violence and hunger. It means surrendering morality to necessity. Some souls are not built to carry that weight forever. Cordelia has chosen to withdraw, to love me from a distance, to prepare her own death while she still has choice in the matter. Will I? Isolde's voice cracked. Will I eventually want that too? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he drew her to the chalice again, guided her to drink more of his blood. And in the visions that followed, she saw centuries stretching forward, unrolling like roads into infinite darkness. She saw herself at Cordelia's age, 300 years hence, tired of immortality, ready for the peace of dissolution. And she saw, underneath that exhaustion, the permanent knowledge that she would choose to stay, because as long as Lucienne existed in the world, her bond to him would be worth the cost. We will face that question together, he said finally. When the time comes, we will choose together. For now, you have only to understand this. By morning, you will no longer be fully mortal. The transformation will continue through blood dreams and slow metamorphosis, and by the next blood moon, which rises 5 nights hence, you will be reborn completely. You will be my equal, my eternal. He kissed her then, and she tasted his blood still on his own lips, an infinite recursion of binding and becoming. And as his mouth found hers in the darkness of the study, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 years of solitude, Isolde understood that she was not being consumed by his darkness. She was finally, after centuries of being lost, coming home. Chapter 6. The Becoming. The transformation was not violent, as she'd feared, but symphonic. For 5 days, Isolde existed in a state of beautiful flux. Her body became permeable. She could feel the walls of Thornwick as an extension of her own skin, sense Lucienne's presence in the air like breath, hear the heartbeat of every creature within 10 miles of the manor. Mirrors showed her face changing, the pupils dilating until almost no iris showed, the skin becoming luminescent, fine veins of silver threading across her temples like a map of stars. She didn't eat. Food tasted of ashes. Instead, Lucienne would bring her small animals, birds, rabbits, and she would feed on them to sustain herself through the metamorphosis. The first time she tasted animal blood, she wept at its purity, its innocence. By the 3rd day, she was hunting them herself, moving through Thornwick's gardens with supernatural speed, diving from the roof in a moment of wild ecstasy before Lucian caught her mid-fall and held her against his chest. "You're learning," he murmured. "The predator is awakening." "Is this who I am now?" she asked, drunk on blood and new sensation. "A monster?" "This is who you have always been beneath the skin," he replied. "The curse merely gives permission for the truth to emerge." The dreams became more vivid, less nightmare and more memory. She walked through Renaissance Florence with Lucienne's eyes, saw the plague pits of Venice, inhabited the mind of Evangelina as she received a mysterious stranger who looked at her with 400 years of hunger and hope. She felt Magnolia's contentment as she carried his child, the bittersweet ache of knowing that their bond was temporary, measured in heartbeats. And she saw, with growing clarity, how the same soul, her soul, had been cycling toward him through time, drawn by a gravity too profound to resist, not trapped, not cursed, but deliberately choosing, again and again, to love him. On the 4th night, Lucienne brought her to the mirror chamber. The mirrors showed her as she truly was now, no longer quite mortal, but not yet fully transformed. Halfway between, suspended in a state of exquisite potential. Her eyes were silver now, shot through with burgundy that deepened as her hunger intensified. Her skin glowed with its own internal light, no longer needing the sun's validation to prove existence. "Tomorrow night, the blood moon rises," he said, his voice reverent. "And at midnight, we perform the final binding. All 3 of them will be here. They've been traveling since you drank from me. They want to witness the completion of the cycle. They want to know you." "Are you afraid?" she asked. "That I'll be disappointed? That I won't be who they expect?" He moved to her, and she saw in his reflection the vulnerability that 400 years couldn't quite hide. "I'm afraid," he admitted, that you'll understand, finally, what you've chosen, and that you'll realize the cost is too high." She turned to face him directly, and he gasped. In the merging of their reflections, mirror within mirror, she saw the totality of their connection. Not just Lucienne and Isolde, but infinite iterations of them, all the lifetimes of loving, all the centuries of searching. She was seeing through time itself, seeing the architecture of their love as it existed not in moments, but in the continuum. "I've already paid the cost," she said. "Lifetime after lifetime, I've paid it, and I would pay it again. 1,000 times I would find you and choose this." That night, she didn't sleep. Instead, she and Lucienne lay in the crypt, her crypt now, the one he'd prepared for her, and he told her stories. He told her about the first monastery where he'd learned to sublimate his hunger through prayer, about the woman in 1620 who'd tried to save him through exorcism, and whom he'd cried over for 20 years, about the revolution in Russia where he'd hidden in the ice for months, watching the old world burn. And somewhere near dawn, when the sky was lightening outside the crypt's single window, he told her about what it meant to love her specifically in this iteration as Isolde. "You are the first one," he said, "who came to me not through chance, but through your own will. You sketched your way to me. You painted yourself into my heart before I ever painted myself into yours. That means something. That means that in this lifetime, the balance has shifted. I'm not just the one who hungers and possesses and binds. You are, for the first time, the one with agency. You are choosing this as much as I am." "Then tonight," she said, watching the first rays of sun turn the crypt's stone crimson. "Tonight, when we bind, I want to give you something. Not just blood, not just obedience or love or eternal companionship. I want to give you forgiveness for every woman before me, for every love that had to end, for every moment of your immortality that was spent in isolation." He turned toward her, his eyes glowing in the gathering light. "You can't forgive what I did to sorrow." "I can," she said softly, "because I was there, in Evangelina's heart, in Magnolia's devotion, in every woman's choice to bind herself to you. I was there, understanding it completely, and I forgave you then. I forgive you now. I will forgive you for eternity, if necessary." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were streaming with tears. Not blood this time, but something else. A water so clear it was almost invisible. The tears of something finally learning how to surrender without being destroyed by the surrender. "Then tonight," he whispered, "we will bind completely. Not as master and servant, not as seducer and seduced, but as equals, as the two halves of a soul that has waited 1,000 years to remember itself, as the memory that forgives what the flesh could never justify." Outside, the sun climbed higher, and Lucienne held her in the darkening chamber, both of them waiting for the blood moon that would seal their covenant. And for the first time in his long immortality, Lucienne Ashford understood that damnation might not be a curse at all, but a choice made in love, renewed again and again across the centuries, never diminishing, never becoming less beautiful for its darkness. Chapter 7. The Blood Moon Ritual. They came as twilight fell, and the first edge of crimson appeared on the eastern horizon. Isolde stood at Thornwick's entrance and felt them before she saw them. 3 presences pressing against her consciousness like old memories trying to reorganize themselves into sense. Then the air shimmered, and they materialized. 3 women who should have been strangers, but felt like sisters. Evangeline arrived first, materializing from the violet shadows of the gallery with the grace of a dancer. She was in her eternal 30s, with dark curled hair and the bearing of a Renaissance duchess. Her eyes were silver like Isolde's, but ringed with violet, the color of depth and old pain. "So," she said in Italian-inflected English, studying Isolde with an intensity that felt like being measured for a garment, "you are the 7th." "The 7th?" Isolde echoed, unsettled. "6 before you," Evangeline continued, walking a slow circle around her. "I was the first to know, the first to understand what he was, and choose anyway. These others, We are the ones who remained. But there are 6 who came before, and in you, I see the completion of something. A cycle closing. She reached out and touched Isolde's cheek with surprising tenderness. You have his eyes, silver and gold, and a hunger that looks almost kind. The others will love you. I already do. Serafina arrived in a gust of autumn wind, her form materializing from the swirling leaves of the dead garden. She was younger, appearing no more than 25, with dark skin that glowed with an internal luminescence and eyes that held the reflective quality of obsidian. She wore modern clothes, black leather and silver chains, and her presence radiated a kind of controlled wildness. The last one, she said without preamble, moving to embrace Isolde with surprising familiarity. I've been dreaming of you since he found me 40 years ago. I knew you'd arrive on the blood moon. I knew you'd be the key. She pulled back to look at Isolde properly. Lucian didn't tell you that we're more than his lovers, did he? We're sisters, all of us, bound not just to him, but to each other. When you bind tonight, you bind to us as well. The third arrived last, and her entrance was so quiet that Isolde almost missed her. Cordelia simply appeared in the library's threshold, as if she'd been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. She was older in appearance, appearing perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that held a particular kind of weariness, the weariness of someone who'd learned to love without hope of ever feeling light again. Isolde, she said, and her voice carried the accent of old Edinburgh. Lucien said you would come. I wasn't sure I believed him. I haven't believed in much for a long time. The afternoon dissolved into introduction and preparation. The women took her to a chamber she hadn't seen before, a ritual space hidden behind the library's furthest shelf. It was circular, with a floor of black marble inlaid with silver runes, and at its center stood an altar carved from bone-white stone. This is where the bindings occur, Evangeline explained, helping Isolde into a gown of pure white that seemed to be spun from moonlight itself, where souls are tied to souls, where blood becomes signature, becomes mark, becomes eternal contract. Does it hurt? Isolde asked. Serafina laughed, a sound like bells breaking. Immensely, but it's the kind of pain that transforms you into something better than yourself. Trust me, I've experienced worse. Lucian found me in a supernatural prison in New Orleans, about to be executed for practicing forbidden magic. The binding saved my life, saved my sanity. Cordelia simply studied her, not unkindly. The pain is real, she said finally. But it's a pain you've been carrying your whole life without knowing it. The binding just makes it visible, gives it name and purpose. After that, you understand. The pain is love, and love is what keeps us immortal. As sunset burned the sky crimson, they led her to the chamber's center. Lucien waited there, no longer in the silk doublet, but in clothes from some antique ceremony, a long robe of deep black embroidered with symbols in silver thread. His eyes burned with a light that was almost unbearable to witness. "Are you ready?" he asked, taking her hands. She nodded, not trusting her voice. The ceremony began. It was older than language, older than the Christianity that Lucien's first death had been built upon. Evangeline began to chant in a tongue that predated Latin. Serafina moved around them in a spiral, her hands weaving patterns in the air that left traces of light. Cordelia stood at each cardinal direction and spoke words that seemed to come from the earth itself. And Lucien held Isolde's wrists and opened his veins. His blood spilled into a chalice of silver, not the wine-dark fluid from before, but something different. His blood in this moment was luminescent, almost white with intensity. It smelled of every flower that had ever bloomed, every star that had ever burned, every love that had ever existed. "Drink," he commanded, and she obeyed. The blood filled her, and the visions came, but not memories this time, futures. She saw herself walking Thornwick's halls 300 years hence, still beautiful, still hungry, still herself. She saw Evangeline teaching her the secrets of music that could bind mortal souls. She saw Serafina initiating her into witchcraft older than Christianity. She saw Cordelia finally releasing her immortality and choosing peace, while Isolde held her hand and wept for the sister she was losing. And underneath all of these futures, she felt Lucian, felt him eternally, in every moment, across every distance, felt his hunger and his hunger become love, his need and his need become tenderness, felt herself becoming part of the architecture that held him together, that gave him reason to continue night after night after night. Then came the moment of binding, and it hurt exactly as Cordelia had promised. It was the sensation of every nerve ending being rewritten, of her very atoms reorganizing themselves to match his frequency, of her blood learning to carry his signature, his consciousness, his eternal presence. She screamed, and Evangeline caught her, held her as she came apart and reformed as something new. When it was over, Isolde lay gasping on the marble floor, and when she opened her eyes, she could see in a way she'd never seen before. Not just light and darkness, but the energetic signatures of every living thing. She could see Lucien as he truly was, not a man at all, but an architecture of immortal light held together by will and hunger and the memory of being human. She could see the three women not as individuals, but as facets of a single jewel, all turning the light differently, all essential to the whole. "Welcome," Lucien whispered, gathering her against his chest, "to eternity." Chapter 8. The Final Darkness. The hunters came 7 days later, just as the blood moon began to wane. Isolde didn't sense them at first. Her immortal senses were still developing, learning to read the subtle signatures of danger. But Cordelia felt them first, her ancient awareness prickling with recognition of something old and malevolent. "Vampire Council," she said grimly, moving toward the window. "Sent to investigate the new binding. They don't like unauthorized covenant creation. It disrupts their hierarchies." She was right. They materialized. In Thornwick's gardens at midnight, 12 figures in the formal dress of different centuries, their eyes glowing with a predatory intelligence that made even the established immortals tense. At their head stood a woman who appeared ancient beyond measure. Pale skin like parchment, eyes that held the accumulated power of 2,000 years. "I am Matriarch Kasha," she announced, her voice echoing through Thornwick's stones, as if she spoke from multiple dimensions at once. "We have come to assess the unauthorized binding and determine whether it has violated council protocols." Lucien stood before his house's threshold, and Isolde felt his fear, not of death, but of losing her, of having her taken from him by the very institution that had allowed his own immortality. "She was bound with full ceremony," Evangeline said, stepping forward to join Lucien. "All three of us witnessed it. The covenant is sealed and recorded in the old ways." "The old ways," Kasha repeated, and something like amusement flickered across her ancient face. "Are you truly suggesting that your private ritual supersedes the council's jurisdiction?" "We suggest nothing," Serafina interjected, her voice sharp. "We state it as fact. The binding predates your council's authority. It comes from the blood magic that created your kind. Your laws do not apply to it." The air around them crackled with tension. Isolde could feel the power rolling off Kasha and her companions. Centuries of accumulated darkness, of ritual feedings, of the kind of predatory mastery that came from dominating lesser immortals. And yet, she found herself stepping forward, moving to stand beside Lucien. "I chose this," she said, and her voice, newly immortal but already carrying the weight of her bond, resonated through the stone itself. "No one forced me. No one compelled me. I came to Thornwick because I was drawn here by blood and memory and something older than the council's laws. I chose to drink. I chose to bind. I choose him." Kasha's attention fixed on Isolde with terrible intensity. "A fresh one," she said, still burning with the fever of new immortality. "Tell me, little fledgling, have you considered what you've surrendered? Your mortal life, yes. Your ability to walk in daylight. Your capacity to eat common food. But also your independence, your autonomy. You are bound to him now. He is the root, and you are the branch. You will feel his hunger. You will hear his voice in your head until you cannot distinguish your own thoughts from his compulsion. By the end of a century, you may not even remember who you were before the binding." "I know all of this," Isolde said, surprising herself with her calm, "and I accept it, because the alternative, separation from him, is unbearable." "Then you are foolish," Kashaw said flatly. "But foolishness has always been the privilege of the young, immortal, or otherwise." She turned back to Lucienne. "The binding is valid so far as the old law goes. But the Council has a judgment for you, Lord Ashford. You have created 5 unauthorized covenant bonds, violations of the hierarchy accords. And for this transgression, one of 2 things must occur. Either you surrender all your bound consorts to the Council's custody and authority, or you surrender yourself to formal trial, with execution as the probable outcome." The words hung in the air like an executioner's axe. Isolde felt Lucien's response before he spoke it, felt it reverberating through their newly created bond, a thing so violent and immediate that it nearly drove her to her knees. His refusal was absolute. His love was absolute. He would choose any punishment, any dissolution, rather than surrender her or any of the women. And she understood in that moment why the council feared him. It wasn't his power or his age. It was his capacity for absolute love. In a world of immortals who'd learned to feed on emotion as much as blood, Lucien's singular devotion was an affront to everything they'd built. "Then we shall prepare the trial," Kashaw said, and raised her hand. The night erupted. It wasn't an attack. It was a summoning. The council's members began to chant in languages predating human civilization, and the air itself seemed to tear open. From the rifts came something vast and terrible, a presence that was neither living nor dead, neither fully physical nor purely spiritual. It was the will of the council made manifest, an ancient thing that fed on the bound and amplified the power of elder vampires. Evangeline and Seraphina rushed toward it, their forms shifting into something more than human, Evangeline becoming a creature of music and light, Seraphina a tiger of liquid shadow. Cordelia stood her ground, and Isolde realized she was drawing power not from malice but from the earth itself, pulling centuries of death and dissolution upward to meet the council's power. But Lucian did something unexpected. He pulled Isolde close, brought his wrist to his mouth, and opened a wound that bled not red but silver. Then he pressed it to her lips. "Drink," he commanded. "Drink of me fully now. Take my power, my knowledge, my centuries. Become my equal, not just in bond, but in strength. I will not—" His voice cut off as the council's manifestation crashed against him like a wave. He staggered, and Isolde tasted his blood, tasted not wine-dark hunger, but pure essence. 400 years of surviving, learning, loving. She felt it coursing through her, and with each drop, she transformed. Her body evolved. Her consciousness expanded. She could see through time itself, could perceive the council's members not as they appeared, but as they truly were, parasites feeding on younger immortals to sustain their own faltering power. And she understood what Lucian was trying to do. He was giving her everything, not to make her strong, but to transfer his life force, his essence, into her. He was attempting a kind of sacrifice. If he merged with her completely, the council couldn't kill him without killing her. It was a blood-bound deathlock that would force them to choose between destroying him or destroying her, and her newness, her potential, would be invaluable to them. "No," she gasped, pulling away from his wrist. "No, I won't let you." "You don't have a choice," he said softly. "I'm the one who loves you most, which means I'm the one who gets to protect you most. This is my privilege. This is my covenant fulfilled." "Then we do it together," she said, understanding in that instant what she had to do. She brought her own wrist to her mouth and opened a wound. Then she pressed it to his lips, bleeding into him even as he bled into her. And together, bound in mutual sacrifice rather than hierarchical possession, they poured themselves into a single vessel. The world went white. When the light cleared, neither Lucienne nor Isolde stood as they had been. Instead, there was something new. a unified consciousness in two bodies, a being that was fundamentally both of them and neither of them. Isolde could feel Lucien's thoughts moving through her mind like blood through veins, could taste his memories like her own past, could access his power as if it had always been her birthright. And in that state of perfect union, they became something the Council's manifestation could not touch. When the ancient thing crashed against them again, they didn't flee or resist. Instead, they embraced it, took its power into themselves, transformed it, transmuted it into something that served their love instead of the Council's hierarchy. Kasha's chant broke off. The other council members staggered back. Impossible, the matriarch hissed. A perfect binding. A consciousness shared between two bodies. This has not occurred in 3,000 years. This violates the very laws of vampire existence. Then change your laws, Isolde and Lucienne said together, their voices in perfect harmony, each word echoing with the power of centuries and the ferocity of newly forged love. Chapter 9. Covenant Acknowledged. The standoff lasted only moments, though time seemed to fracture around them. Kasha studied the unified consciousness in two forms, and something ancient and calculating moved behind her empty eyes. She lowered her hand, and the Council's manifestation retreated, not defeated, but merely withdrawn. "We will report this to the High Conclave," she said finally. "Your binding violates precedent, but it is undeniably valid according to the oldest laws. The Council cannot diminish what blood has created. However," her pale eyes fixed on Isolde and Lucien both, "you have created something dangerous, a union of consciousness that transcends hierarchy. The Council will watch you, and should you attempt to create another binding like this, we will respond with the full force of our authority. Do you understand?" Isolde felt the threat, understood its weight, but she also felt Lucien's acceptance, his recognition, that they had won, that the Council's tolerance was as much victory as they could expect. "We understand," they said in unison. The Council members began to dissolve, their forms fragmenting into shadow and wind, returning to whatever realm of power they inhabited. Kasha was last to depart, and before she vanished completely, she turned back to Lucienne. 473 years, she said, and there was something almost like respect in her ancient voice. 473 years you have loved without breaking, without cruelty, without the hunger eating you hollow from inside. It is remarkable, foolish, but remarkable. She paused. The last time one of my kind loved that way was 2,000 years ago. I will not see another in all the centuries to come. Cherish it, Lord Ashford. Such things are rarer than diamonds in the dark. Then she was gone, and Thornwick fell silent. Evangeline, Seraphina, and Cordelia emerged from their defensive positions, all three of them staring at Isolde and Lucien with a mixture of awe and concern. "You're still connected," Cordelia said, her ancient eyes reading something in their auras that the others couldn't perceive. "The union hasn't broken. You're actually sharing a single consciousness across two bodies." It was true. Isolde could feel it, could feel her thoughts not as separate from Lucien's, but as waves in the same ocean. When she moved, she sensed his movement in her muscles. When he breathed, she felt his breath in her lungs. When he thought, his words appeared in her mind before they reached his lips. "Is this permanent?" she asked, unsettled by the violation of her own mental boundaries, though calling it a violation felt wrong when the presence moving through her mind belonged to the person she loved most in any lifetime. "No," Lucienne said, and she felt the gentleness in his response. "This is a moment of perfect synchronization. Eventually, our consciousness will separate again. But we'll always carry this union in our bones. We'll always remember what it felt like to be completely understood, to have no barriers between us. For the rest of eternity, we'll be reaching toward that moment of perfect unity, again and again." He took her hand, and the action was sacred, weighted with significance. Where their fingers touched, light bloomed, not the harsh illumination of electricity, but the soft radiance of two souls recognizing themselves in each other. "The binding is complete," Evangeline said softly. "Not just blood, but consciousness. Not just hunger, but understanding. Lucian, what you've created. She trailed off, shaking her head in wonder. It's not what we are. It's something new. Something that might actually be redemption. It is, Cordelia said, and her ancient voice held no bitterness, only a strange kind of peace. I've been waiting 300 years to see him love like this, to love without possession, without the need to consume, and now I see it's because she loves him the same way. It's not his salvation, Evangeline, it's theirs, mutual, reciprocal, equal. That night they gathered in the library, no longer hunter and hunted, predator and prey, eternal and mortal. Simply 5 souls bound together by blood and choice, and the particular grace of being understood completely by another. Evangeline brought music, her fingers moving across a grand piano that had been locked in silence for decades, coaxing forth melodies that seemed to contain the entirety of human emotion in symphonic form. Serafina created light, weaving patterns in the air that seemed to describe the history of the universe, stars being born, dying, transforming into new forms. Cordelia sat in silence, her ancient face relaxed in something approaching contentment, and Isolde and Lucienne danced. They moved together in the library's center, not touching, but so attuned to each other that they might as well have been a single form. Her movements were his, and his movements hers. Where he stepped, she was already there. Where she turned, he had already anticipated the spiral. "I've been waiting for you," he whispered, though she heard it not with her ears but with her entire being, the words moving through the bond that connected them. "I know," she replied, and her voice was her own and his simultaneously. "I've been coming to you my entire life. Every sketch, every dream, every moment of orphaned loneliness was a step toward this, toward you, toward us." As midnight approached, they moved closer and their bodies began to merge. Not physically, they remained 2 distinct forms, but energetically, spiritually. Their auras overlapped, creating a third presence that was neither one nor the other, but a synthesis, a union, a completion. "What are we?" Isolde whispered. "The answer to a question that's been asked for 400 years, Lucienne replied. "What does it mean to love forever? What happens when 2 souls choose each other across impossible distances? We are that answer. We are the proof that even damnation can contain grace." In the mirror chamber beneath the manor, at the moment of perfect midnight, the ancient mirrors reflected not 2 beings, but one. A being that was both Lucienne and Isolde, immortal and forever beginning, damned and irredeemably loved. And that being turned to its own reflection, and for the first time in its fragmented eternal existence, smiled. Chapter 10. Eternal Resolution. 300 years passed. Time moved differently for the immortal, compressing centuries into breaths and stretching moments into eternities. Thornwick Manor became a sanctuary for those seeking refuge from the predatory hierarchies of the council, a place where immortals could be reborn into something gentler than the hunger that had created them. Evangeline taught young vampires how to sublimate their thirst through music, channeling bloodlust into symphonic beauty. Serafina built a small coven of witches and magicians, all of them learning to transcend the dark arts into something approaching transcendence. Cordelia eventually chose her release, and Isolde held her hand as the Ancient One surrendered to daylight and final sleep, their bond transforming into memory and gratitude. But Lucienne and Isolde remained, forever unified and forever seeking the perfect union they'd briefly experienced in that moment of shared consciousness. They bound 3 more souls to them across the centuries, each binding less spectacular than the first, but no less genuine. A scholar who'd been rejected by the council for questioning their authority. A musician who'd played Evangeline's compositions and fell in love with the philosophy of redemptive darkness. A warrior woman who'd spent 2 centuries hunting vampires before Lucienne saved her from an execution and taught her that some predators could transcend their nature. And through it all, Isolde painted, She filled galleries with her work, anonymous, hidden from the council's scrutiny, but known among the immortal underground as the documentation of something beautiful. Her art showed the transition from hunger to grace, from solitude to communion. She painted Lucien 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times, never capturing exactly what he was, because what he was transcended the medium of paint and canvas. On the 300th anniversary of their binding, they stood in a new gallery, hidden beneath the library of Thornwick, a space she'd only recently completed. The walls were covered in her work, 3 centuries of evolution rendered in oil and charcoal, ink and blood. "You've painted our entire life together," Lucien said softly, moving from canvas to canvas, seeing himself through the lens of infinite love. "Every moment of evolution, every crisis, every joy." "Not our life," Isolde corrected gently. "The artifact of our love, the external manifestation of what happens inside when 2 souls decide that eternity is a small price to pay for being understood completely." He took her hand, and where they touched, the familiar warmth bloomed. 3 centuries, and she still felt it, the connection that transcended physical sensation. The sense of Lucien's essence recognizing her own, the ancient greeting of souls that had chosen each other across all possible realities. "How much longer do you think we'll continue?" she asked. It was a question they'd been avoiding for decades, the inevitable question that came to all immortals eventually. "As long as you want to," he replied. "When you're ready to let go, I will let you go. I've learned how to release what I love. Cordelia taught me that, but..." He paused, and she felt the hope flickering through their bond. "What if we didn't? What if we continued? What if we lived to see what becomes of the world? What becomes of us?" She looked at the paintings surrounding them. 300 years of artistic evolution, 300 years of documented love, and she realized that she couldn't imagine a future where she existed separately from Lucien. The prospect of his eternal continuation without her, or her continuation without him, was unbearable in a way that transcended even the hunger. "Then we continue," she said simply. That night, they stood on Thornwick's roof and watched the stars turn in their eternal patterns. Somewhere in the city, mortal lovers were waking to the realization that their time together was finite. Somewhere, other immortals were drinking from the desperate and feeding on the lonely, and somewhere, the council was extending its hierarchies, its laws, its predatory structures across continents and centuries. But here, in this moment, there was only love, pure, transcendent, the kind of love that justified damnation because it transformed damnation into something approaching redemption. "I painted you in my dreams before I met you," Isolde whispered, remembering that first moment of recognition when she'd found the portrait. "And I waited in darkness before you painted me," Lucien replied, taking her hand. "But now we don't have to wait. Now we can simply be." And as the blood moon rose over Thornwick Manor, as it had 1,000 times before, and would 1,000 times again, 2 souls moved closer together in the darkness, forever seeking that moment of perfect union, forever grateful for the damned grace that allowed them to continue searching. The paintings in the gallery below continued to accumulate, each one a testament to the same impossible truth, that love, in all its forms, predatory and generous, selfish and absolute, was the only genuine immortality. Everything else was merely waiting. Epilogue. The mirror reflects. In the mirror chamber, deep beneath Thornwick Manor, something stirred. It began as the faintest shimmer, a disturbance in the surface of the glass, as if the barrier between worlds had grown temporarily thin. The mirrors showed the past bleeding into the present, Isolde in her orphanage uniform, sketching Lucien's face for the first time. Lucien in the crypt, his journal spread before him, documenting centuries of solitude, the 2 of them in the library, dancing at midnight, their auras merging into that impossible unity. But the final image was different. In the mirror's reflection, the future appeared, a vague, impressionistic thing, but undeniable. A girl with dark eyes and Isolde's artistic gift stood in this very chamber. She wasn't born, not yet. She existed only as potential, as promise. And in the far background of that future vision, standing slightly apart, was a presence, neither fully formed nor completely absent. A fifth binding, waiting to be born. The prophecy had come full circle. Evangeline, long departed from Thornwick, traveling the world with her music, would one day find herself in a city where a young woman sketched in subway stations, her drawings carrying too much raw emotion to be technically flawed. She would recognize the signature of Isolde's gift, the inheritance of consciousness, the bloodline binding. And she would bring that girl to Thornwick, where the circle would expand again. Seraphina, existing in some liminal realm between witch and vampire, would one day encounter a soldier broken by war, someone whose capacity for violence had been weaponized and then abandoned by the institutions that created it. She would offer redemption through a different kind of darkness, the darkness of choice, of agency, of being fed rather than feeding. And Lucien and Isolde would welcome them both, and the covenant would evolve again, would become something new and more beautiful than before, because each soul brought its own fracture, its own wound, its own particular way of needing to be loved. The mirrors showed this future not as promise, but as certainty. Time worked differently for immortals, and prophecy worked the way blood worked, inevitable, irresistible, written into the very fabric of existence. Isolde, sleeping in the chamber beneath the manor, in the soil that mirrored Lucien's own rest, felt the vision in her dreams. She stirred, not waking, but deepening, sinking further into the darkness from which renewal came. And in that darkness, she heard Lucien's voice, speaking not with words, but with the intimacy of perfect understanding. It continues. The love continues. The binding continues. And we will meet them, these new souls, with the same absolute conviction that we met each other. We will love them across all possible realities. We will paint them into being with our own flesh and blood, and they, in turn, will paint us. This is what it means to be damned in love, not isolated, but echoing, not terminal, but cyclical. The curse becomes the blessing, and the blessing becomes the covenant, and the covenant renews itself eternally because somewhere, someone is always sketching the face of their eternal, always painting the portrait of their doom become salvation. Isolde's sleeping form smiled in the darkness, and above, in the gallery of paintings, the newest canvas, blank mere hours before, began to fill itself with images. Not through brush or hand, but through the pure force of artistic will, channeled across the bond that connected her to Lucien, channeled through the immortal inheritance that was becoming, with each passing century, more about transcendence than hunger. The painting showed a library full of immortals, all of them connected by threads of light and blood and love. Lucien at the center, but not as predator, as anchor, as source, as the living memory of what it meant to survive 400 years, not through cruelty, but through the revolutionary act of choosing to love better, to love deeper, to love absolutely. And around him, 5 women, no, 6, no, infinitely expanding outward, each one adding another color to the spectrum of what redemption might look like, if redemption was actually this: the refusal to stop loving, the commitment to continue transforming, the absolute conviction that damnation and grace were not opposites but lovers, spinning around each other eternally in the darkness. Outside the manor, the blood moon continued its path across the sky. Inside, in rooms lit by candlelight and starlight and the luminescence of souls that had learned to become their own light, the covenant breathed, lived, loved. And somewhere, in a city far away, a young woman took up a pencil and began to sketch the face of someone she'd never met. And as her hand moved across the paper, she felt, for just a moment, the presence of ancient eyes watching from darkness, familiar eyes, kind eyes, eyes that had been waiting for her to remember. The circle had not closed, it had merely widened, and it would continue to widen, for as long as souls were desperate enough, brave enough, or simply foolish enough to believe in love.